The input and output modules in a PLC are also called signal modules because they are connectors between the electrical signals and the CPU. The input and output modules, also known as signal modules, are generally divided into two categories: digital signal modules and analog signal modules. As we discussed in the previous lesson, the reason for this categorization is usually because we have two kinds of signals in the industry that are extensively used: digital signals and analog signals. In this lesson and the next, we're going to learn the functionality of the signals of both digital and analog modules and how they operate. So first, we'll start off with digital signal modules. In a PLC, we could possibly have two types of digital signal modules: digital signal modules that are used for inputs and the digital signal modules that are used for outputs. But how do these modules work? In order to better understand how they work, let's work through by an example. Suppose in a process we have a tank and we want the outgoing pipe to automatically open up and empty the tank whenever it gets filled up with water. So now we have to see what sorts of facilities we need to have in order to do so. In order to see when the tank fills up, we place a 24-volt DC float switch in here, and we can also use a 24-volt solenoid valve in order to connect and disconnect the outgoing water flow from the tank. This float switch has a simple contact, which is open by default, and when the liquid level in the tank gets to that certain surface level, this contact closes up. Okay, now in order for the PLC to receive this signal, we need to connect a wire from one of the channels of the digital input modules to one end of the sensor's open contact, and from that end of the contact, connect another wire again to the next channel of the input module. In this case, when the float switch is working, this contact closes and a 24-volt signal gets sent to the digital input module. So far, the signal has gone to one end of the PLC input module. However, as we've said before, this signal is an electrical signal, and so it can't be processed by the CPU. Therefore, the digital input module receives this electric signal and converts it to the logic data, which can be processed by the CPU. When the CPU receives the data, it starts processing it based on the programs that have been given to it, and then it sends it a series of commands, which this time is in the form of logic data to the digital output module. The digital output module receives this logic data from the CPU and once again converts it back to a 24-volt electric signal so that it can apply it to the valve, and by means of doing this, it can tell the valve when to open and when to close. The way the solenoid valve operates is pretty simple. This actuator gets in the way of the water flow. The liquid enters into the valve from this side and it leaves from the other side. In the internal structure of this valve, we have a coil, a spring, and a plunger. In default mode, the plunger blocks the path through which the liquid passes, but whenever the coil becomes energized, an electromagnetic field gets created around itself, and this makes the plunger move upward, and hence the path through which the liquid flows opens up. Therefore, whenever the digital output module applies a 24-volt signal to the coil of this valve, it energizes the coil and the valve opens up. Otherwise, the valve is closed, and so it blocks the fluid flow. So, considering the example we made here, we see that the digital input and output modules act like a connector between the CPU and the sensors and the actuators that we have in the process. In here, the digital input module acts like a connector between the CPU and the level sensor, and the digital output module also acts as a connector between the CPU and the solenoid valve.